Hello everyone, this is Jinxo, the Switchaxe stan formerly known as a Monster Hunter math guy. So as of recording, it is the 27th of June right now, meaning that Sunbreak is only 3 days away. And with the demo out, I'm very happy to say that the speedrun scene has been very alive for these demo monsters. Which is really nice to see because if you're not really into the speedrun scene of Monster Hunter games, Monster Hunter Rise has been relatively dead compared to the likes of World and Iceborne. And as an aside, it's just really nice to see the amount of enthusiasm and volume of runs coming out of the speedrun community for the demo for Sunbreak. And with a good volume of speedruns, we have plenty of opportunity to see what optimal play looks like for these various weapons. By the way, links to all of the actual speedruns that we show off, as well as any of the various resources and charts used for the video will be in the description. Now, it is important to note that the demo does not have all of the switch skill changes that we'll be expecting in Sunbreak. We also don't know if all of the motion values, in other words the amount of damage each attack deals, is final or not. And also, demo sets definitely do not reflect what endgame sets and weapons look like. So this is definitely something we'll need to revisit when Sunbreak actually comes out and we have all of those final numbers as well as a good healthy amount of speedruns to look at. So please take this with massive grains, piles of salt, because demos are not representative of the final product. But at this point, if we want to talk about what will be the strongest weapon in Sunbreak, we either have to speculate wildly or use the data we have, so we're gonna do that one. And what we do have is all of these world record speedruns for the demo monsters for Sunbreak. Final caveat before we get into the actual subject at hand, weapon ranking doesn't actually matter. This is a PvE game, you don't have to play the meta weapon, play the weapon you like, play the playstyle you like, as long as you're finishing the hunts without carting 3 times, who gives a damn? This analyses or any kind of analyses on speedruns or weapon strength or any kind of tier lists do not really actually matter as long as you actually are enjoying the game and you are playing how you want to. Do not use any of these as an excuse to bully other people or to just be overall a dick online. None of this actually matters. Just because the world record god level speedrunner of your particular weapon kills things a little faster than the other world record god level speedrunner of a different weapon does not make you inherently better and does not make your weapon better, and just don't be mean. Alright, with that said, based off of the demo and all of its various changes it has for all of the new switch skills and various new playstyles for weapons, what is going to be the strongest weapon? It's bow. It's gonna be bow. Bow does both things and is just gonna continue doing both things. The bow in the demo doesn't even have bow charge plus and is still hitting the first fastest time for Malzeno as well as the third fastest time for Astalos. Overall, when you weight these evenly, it ends up in second place right after Greatsword and above Switchaxe. It's also important to note that Astalos is a really bad matchup for bow because it has really terrible shot hit zone values. Really, the fact that bow is still second place despite being a demo bow, which is really terrible, it's pretty impressive. In fact, despite the fact that they did terrible in the demo, heavy bowgun and light bowgun are probably going to join bow as the top 3 weapons again for speedruns in Sunbreak, especially because master rank gear is probably going to be a bigger boost to bowguns than anything else due to more availability of level 3 deco slots that they are very starved on. I mean, demo bowgun weapons and sets just kinda suck. It's actually very possible for heavy bowgun to outdo bow in a lot of, if not a majority of matchups, just because they're adding what is effectively siege mode back in Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. You know, that thing in the preview they showed off called crouching shot, which is literally just make heavy bowgun shoot faster at the cost of not moving. And bow optimal play is probably not going to change, at least with any of the actual moveset changes they've shown so far. At the very least, for both the world record run for Astalos and for Malzeno, the bow plays literally no differently than it does for the world record run of literally any monster in Monster Hunter Rise base. It doesn't do anything differently, doesn't use any of the new moves, it just plays exactly the same. And based on what I've seen from the previews, I don't think any of the new moves are gonna be any better than just dash dancing, shooting something in the face, and dodge bolting every attack that comes your way. Heavy bowgun also doesn't play any differently, you just shoot the thing, make sure you don't get hit by the thing, and then occasionally counter the thing. The light bowgun world record speedrun actually does make quite a bit of use of the John Woo counter move, which is pretty neat. So we might end up seeing a lot of use of that in the Sunbreak world records, at least against monsters that light bowgun can't just lock down and murder. But ending on that note makes for an incredibly boring video, so let's just pretend that the gunner weapons don't exist and instead focus on the top ranking Blade Master weapons. So if we take a look at the list without bow in it, then it goes Greatsword, Switchaxe, Gunlance, Insect Glaive, Charge Blade, and Longsword. So let's take a look at these 6 weapons and how the moveset changes in the Sunbreak Demo affected them. I want to talk both from the speedrunner angle of how these will affect world record runs, as well as how they'll affect more casual players. Because these are 2 separate, distinct, different things, especially when certain things end up being incredibly high skill level and may not be as applicable to regular players. Originally, I wanted to talk about all of the weapons, but I'll be honest, I ain't got time for that. I either talk about half the weapons, or I talk about none of them. Now, with Greatsword at the top, Greatsword must clearly be the one that's looking to be the strongest in Sunbreak, right? Well, maybe. We'll get into that. First, I want to talk about the major outliers, which are both Gunlance and Insect Glaive. So let's start with Gunlance. In base Monster Hunter Rise, Gunlance was dead last out of all of the weapons in terms of speedruns. But in the Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak Demo, Gunlance has jumped up to the number 3 spot out of the Blade Master weapons. This is a change of 8 places. Now, let's start off with the obvious. Gunlance always looks better in demos than it does in actual endgame. This is because Gunlance's explosions scale with very little investment, but don't actually scale that high. And demo sets are fucking terrible. They have like no multipliers for any weapons. Although the Gunlance's loadout of skills in the demo actually are pretty decent. But in endgame, your shilling damage doesn't end up being really that high compared to what other weapons can do. And when built for effective raw damage, Slap Lance just doesn't really perform as well as other weapons. And then the hybridization of your damage in your full burst builds just makes you less efficient overall. Basically, Gunlance gets outscaled in late game and just falls off damage-wise. That all being said, the new Bullet Barrage switch skill they added in the Sunbreak Demo is a pretty significant buff to Gunlance. It gives you a massive amount of burst damage by dumping all of your shells, your worm stake, as well as your wyvern fire all in one big ass go. If you like explosions, it makes a lot of them and a lot of damage numbers appear. This adds a lot of burst DPS to Gunlance's kit. On top of that, the reload animation you do beforehand has hyper armor and reduced damage. And with Wirebug Whisperer 3, which every single weapon in the demo actually has, you can spam this pretty frequently. Now, I'm not a Gunlance expert. In fact, I've never actually played the weapon in Monster Hunter Rise so far, but this does look like a pretty significant buff to me. From what I have seen of Gunlance speedruns, they're mostly either full burst or heroic slap lance. And at least in the case of full burst, this looks like a pretty decent damage upgrade to just be able to dump out this much damage with hyper armor frames anytime you have 2 Wirebugs up. I would not be surprised to see Gunlance rise up quite a few rankings in the final Sunbreak release in terms of speedruns, especially because the runs aren't actually that much slower than a lot of the slower weapons in the game. And honestly, with how cool this attack is and how much you can use it as a counter mechanic for a lot of monsters, I would not be surprised to see more Gunlance speedrunners showing up in the scene in Sunbreak. And the more competitive it gets, the faster the speedruns get. And, well, for casual players, this is just an amazingly cool and powerful move. The less skilled you are, the more value you get out of these kinds of Wirebug skills because they're on the cooldown. Speedrunners get relatively less value because while they're waiting for the cooldowns to come up, they have to figure out how to maximize DPS in between. But hell, if you're a casual player, you can just use this as the only thing you use to kill monsters and it'll probably still speed up your times. Not to mention that the hyper armor as well as the fixed damage that shelling deals regardless of what body part you hit is really nice for a casual player. That being said, this move may take some practice to get used to landing because of how long the windup is in the fixed direction. I'm actually half considering building an endgame set with this Gunlance move because I want to use it in multiplayer for memes. So yeah, demo Gunlance probably isn't very indicative of how well Gunlance will do, so it's probably not going to be a tippity top ranking speedrun weapon in Sunbreak, but I would be very surprised personally if it doesn't rise higher. Alright, next up we have Insect Glaive. So IG went up a full 3 rankings in the demo compared to how it is in base Monster Hunter Rise. This is pretty significant, however, just like with Gunlance, I'm not sure how indicative this will be of the final game. At least in terms of endgame, but I'll get to that. So in the demo, the 2 main new tools we see used heavily in the speedruns are the Awakened Kinsect attack as well as the Powder Vortex. The Powder Vortex lets you collect up all the powder dust left by your bug to just make a big ass explosion that does a lot of damage. While the Awakened Kinsect attack allows you to burn all of your extracts in order to get a bunch of powder clouds and a chunk of damage out as well as yeet yourself over to the monster. Combine this with the Powder Vortex and you get a big explosion and big numbers. This combo is used very heavily in the Astalos World Record run and is used almost exclusively in the Malzeno run. The Astalos run does use a decent amount of Wyvern diving at the beginning, and this does take up the same switch skill slot as the Wyvern dive, although I'm pretty sure they're just using Wyvern dive as a way to deal good DPS while also building up a mount. The Awakened Insect attack does not seem to build up a lot of, if much of any, mounting damage, but also Astalos has very good hit zones on a lot of body parts when they're charged, which allows the well-placed Wyvern dives to deal some chunky DPS. However, the Powder Vortex does deal more DPS, which we can tell because the speedrunner switches over to using it exclusively after the mount's done. And for the particular speedrun strat they're using, it's very important to get that mount. This strat involves riding Astalos all the way to the north so you can have both Rathian as well as fancy Kulu Yaku beat on him. This allows you to maximize the damage you get out of environmentals and other monsters, which must be higher than the DPS that the Insect Glaive can put out, because otherwise they would be using a different strat that the GS and the Switchaxe use. As for the Malzeno run, they pretty much just spam the Awakened Insect into Powder Vortex combo until the thing dies. Now, the strat they use for this one is different. They actually go for a water area start. This start actually has lower overall environmental and monster damage than going for the fire area start, and the only reason I can see for doing it is because you can use Tetranodon to actually make Malzeno mountable. And with how low our damage is due to the demo sets and weapons we're using, the environmental damage we get against Malzeno is pretty significant. My guess is that the Awakened Insect attack spam just isn't going to build up enough mounting damage to get a mount off in time on Malzeno with a fire area start. And that is pretty much what they're going to be spamming consistently throughout this entire run. Now, this combo does do very significant damage in the demo, but I'm not fully convinced it's going to end up being the meta playstyle for IG and Sunbreak. And that's because of the powder's possible scaling. Now, I'll be honest, I don't know what the powder does scale with, but it looks like a fixed damage type. If it is a fixed damage type based off of something like, let's say, a Kinsect level, then similar to Gunlance shelling, it may fall off in the endgame, compared to EFR scaling melee combos like using Tornado Slash or Wyvern Dive like you see in Vice Monster Hunter Rise. And if this scaling does fall off in late game, then you won't really be seeing it that much in speedruns for Sunbreak. However, this is all speculation, and I just haven't had the time to do any kind of testing if it's even possible to test anything scaling-wise in the demo. But if we do assume that it does fall off and we go to more of the melee attack focused builds that you see normally for IG and Rise, the Awakened Insect attack is still a pretty neat little thing to have in your pocket, because when your buffs are about to run out, you can just yeet them into a monster for some free damage. And then afterwards you can switch back over to Wyvern Dive if that's what you're spamming. So in terms of how indicative this rise in IG's power is for speedruns in Sunbreak, it's really hard to say without knowing how the scaling is, but I would be kind of surprised personally if the powder did scale well into late game. Being able to use the Awakened Insect attack when your buffs are about to run out is a minor buff to speedrunners, but unless the powder style ends up being incredibly strong, I wouldn't expect to see IG rise too much. However, for casual players, being able to just basically spam the crap out of your bug, make little powder explosions that do a crap load of damage, and not have to worry about hitting the monster with melee attacks for the most part is definitely a much easier and pretty fun looking playstyle. Kinda like playing light bowgun, but with a bug that makes explosions and occasionally yeeting yourself at the monster. So if you're into that kind of playstyle, it's definitely a new option and could potentially be pretty strong for casual players. Alright, now that we've talked about IG, next up let's talk about Chargeblade. I want to talk about the last three, Longsword, Greatsword, as well as Switchaxe altogether, because boy is that one juicy. Alright, Chargeblade. So Chargeblade was 6th place in base Rise and is 5th place currently in the Sunbreak demo. Chargeblade is a particularly interesting weapon because it actually has 3 distinct playstyles used for speedruns in base Rise. One is your traditional playstyle of SAAD spam using counter peak performance. You see this used against a lot of the roster where counter peak performance is good for countering their attacks. The other is using Axe Hopper with the Load Shells level 2 armor skill that allows you to max out your files off of Yellow Charge. I haven't crunched the actual motion value per second myself, but as I understand it, Axe Hopper spam is better than SAAD spam for DPS output. It also allows you to reposition when you do so. And then the other is to use the Pizza Cutter to shred a single weak zone. This is really good for headlockable opponents like Teostra, and plays a lot less like a counter style and more like a beat a monster and keep it down style. Now, we can't really talk about what any of the changes will do for the Pizza Cutter playstyle because, well, none of the World Record runs in the Sunbreak demo use the style. Also, the actual armor set and weapon used in the Sunbreak demo aren't really appropriate for that playstyle since they focus on fire damage. That being said, the new Ready Stance switch skill they add in the demo does allow you to gain access to a guard point block while maintaining your condensed spinning / pizza cutter. This gives you the option to continue playing a spinning / playstyle while actually having a defensive option of blocking. You do have to switch out your counter peak performance to be able to do so, but I mean, after you've counter peak performance to max files, you don't really need that much file upkeep for the pizza cutter playstyle, so this is a pretty big boon for that, and we might see more pizza cutter speedruns. But as for the demo, the optimal playstyle ended up being SAD spam, so we don't really get to see much of that in action. And in terms of that playstyle, we pretty much don't see any use of the new switch skills for Chargeblade. They play pretty traditionally. The big boon that Chargeblade got in this demo and will have in Sunbreak from these changes is the ability to switch between counter peak performance and axe hopper. Counter peak performance is an incredibly easy to use, very powerful guard point that gives you max files. On top of that, it always has a minimum knockback regardless of your guard level, so you don't really need any in a lot of matchups, which gives you access to more DPS. While Axe Hopper is a more powerful SAD that allows you to dodge attacks while using it, allows you to reposition completely, and also control where the origin point of your explosions start from. Pretty much in the past, you had to choose one of the two to play. You either could use counter peak performance for incredible defensive capabilities and fast file buildup, or you had to instead use Axe Hopper for great offensive capabilities but had to rely on more traditional means of building up files. Now you can just swap between whichever one you want based on the situation. For the counter peak performance defensive playstyles, this is a big boon because Axe Hopper can be used during downs and the like. This basically guarantees that every SAD on a down monster is at the perfect angle and position, while for Axe Hopper spam monsters, they simply get all of their setup done faster because counter peak performance allows them to build up files so quickly. The hybridization of these two playstyles is basically just going to make them better against every matchup that you use either of these against. The SAD playstyle basically just got access to both its best defensive option as well as its best offensive option simultaneously. That being said, there's definitely going to be some changes of matchups now that Pizza Cutter actually gets access to a good block ability. Because it didn't really have the ability to block and dodge rolls kind of suck in Rise, Pizza Cutter was very much limited to only being used against monsters that you could pretty much only keep down all the time. It is going to depend on what the endgame sets as well as the endgame DPS outputs look like, but I wouldn't be surprised to see Pizza Cutter being used on more matchups that were previously SAD matchups. And outside of the speedrunning scene, this is just a massive boon for pretty much any casual player because being able to use counter peak performance, which is the easiest way to not get hit out of Chargeblade's kit, and then being able to swap to Axe Hopper, which is just significantly easier to land on monsters than traditional SADs, is just a massive boon. And for those casual players who are into Pizza Cutter, well, now you can actually reasonably play this without getting knocked around silly. Because you can actually block now, and unless you were good at trip locking a monster, it was really hard to play Pizza Cutter efficiently. Alright, finally let's talk about the big three: Longsword, Greatsword, and Switchaxe. In both base Rise as well as a Sunbreak demo, these three are definitely the big three with the most eyes on them. They also arguably had the biggest change in the Sunbreak demo and may have the biggest changes in Sunbreak period. In base Monster Hunter Rise, these three weapons competed for the top 3 Blade Master spots, generally with Longsword being pretty far ahead of the rest with the exception of a few Greatsword Heroics runs. And in the Sunbreak demo, Longsword has had a meteoric fall of 5 whole ranks from number 1 to number 6. So what happens? Well, before you Longsword haters start cheering and celebrating, there are a few caveats. So first off, Longsword did in fact get a nerf, but it got a buff at the same time. It's kind of a nerf buff. So basically what happened is that EI Spirit Slash's base motion value, in other words its base damage, got cut in half. This is a massive nerf to Longsword. However, when inside of the Harvest Moon switch skill they just added that makes a big circle that enhances your counterattacks, your EI Spirit Slash now does a massive 5% more damage. And this is assuming all of the ticks hit. Apparently in the Sunbreak demo the ticks aren't super consistent with getting max ticks all the time. Not sure if this is an issue with the demo or just happens to be an actual intended thing. A neat thing about Harvest Moon 2 is you always have max spirit gauge while you're inside of it, so you can just basically spam your spirit combo anytime you have an opening. There's also some other motion value changes, most notably the Sakura slash skill got a massive damage increase. It also got a very significant cooldown decrease in terms of its wire bug regeneration, while Helmbreaker's damage has not changed, but its cooldown has increased significantly. Otherwise, the other buffs to motion values are rather minor, with some buffs to foresight and spirit combos. Now, with the traditional playstyle that Longsword has, which is pretty much just spamming spirit EI slash and then fitting in Helmbreakers and other hits in the middle, which is the style used exclusively in speedruns, this is arguably either going to be the same, a slight buff, or a slight nerf. It's going to depend on a lot of factors such as the matchup, whether the actual Harvest Moon ticks end up being consistent or not, as well as whether the Helmbreaker cooldown actually affects you in the matchup, because you can spam enough Helmbreakers for it to catch up on you. I'll talk about all of these factors in a second, but really the big takeaway is that optimal Longsword gameplay just got a lot more skill intensive. This is because in order for your EI Spirit slash counter playstyle to be as effective as before, you have to be doing it inside of Harvest Moon. This is difficult because if you hit the edge of Harvest Moon, you end up taking damage, and if that happens twice, then you lose the Harvest Moon. Also, if you sheath your weapon regularly to heal, you lose Harvest Moon. And if the monster leaves Harvest Moon, you need to get rid of Harvest Moon. This does make this traditional playstyle of spamming EI Spirit slash into Helmbreakers a lot more skill intensive. Now, theoretically, inside of Harvest Moon, your EI Spirit slash should be dealing 5% more damage than it was previously, which is a slight buff. However, that does depend on whether the ticks come out consistently or not, because in a demo, they don't always land 4 ticks. Now, Helmbreaker does the same damage, but it does have a cooldown increase. If you're in a matchup where you can't use Helmbreaker all that often anyway due to a lack of openings, this doesn't make much of a difference. But if you do have access to more Helmbreaker openings, this means you get less Helmbreakers. So this is either neutral or it's a nerf. However, you also get access to switch skill swapping, which means you can now use both Sakura Slash as well as Helmbreaker, and Sakura Slash got a significant buff. Sakura Slash now deals pretty competitive damage, and on top of that, still gives you an extra spirit level when you use it, which means that on longer downs, you can weave between this and Helmbreaker, assuming you have the wire bugs. Being able to do this is overall a buff against monsters that have long enough downs that you can actually weave these two, which is the case for when you knock Malzeno out of his red mode, and is also the same for monsters like Valstrax when you knock them out of their red mode. Not to mention, Harvest Moon also gives you unlimited maximum spirit gauge while you're in it, meaning you can spam your spirit combos in any opening you have. So when this playstyle is executed to its max possible potential, this is numerically arguably a buff for Longsword. Assuming all the ticks can consistently land, then with the new Harvest Moon skill, your EI Spirit Slash does 5% more damage potentially. Helmbreaker's a bit less spammable, but you do get to spam unlimited amounts of your spirit combo and openings, as well as access to the Helmbreaker Sakura Slash Helmbreaker combo. And at the max level of optimal play, the downsides of Harvest Moon don't really matter, because if you get hit and have to heal, you're resetting your run anyway. And if you're gonna be resetting anyway, then if a monster leaves Harvest Moon, you're resetting anyway. Which might be more frustrating for Longsword speedrunners, because you might have to reset for monster AI more often. But they also have the largest speedrunning community out of any single one of the weapons in the game, except maybe bow, as well as a weapon that is basically tailor-made for the monsters in this game, so I think they'll be fine. Now, while this all kind of sucks for Longsword players, I also don't really personally mind it that much, because honestly, Longsword was a bit too easy to play considering how much damage output it had. I played a good amount of Longsword in Iceborne, and then when I started playing it in Rise, I dropped it very quickly because it just felt incredibly overtuned and too easy. Helmbreaker is easier to land than it was in Iceborne. On top of that, EI Spirit Slash no longer lost you a spirit level if you messed up the timing. Not to mention that at least compared to Monster Hunter World, Monster Hunter Rise has a much higher focus on counters in terms of monster design. Hopping and rolling through attacks in Monster Hunter Rise is much weaker due to the decreased iframes and the increased aggressiveness of monsters in Sunbreak, so countering just becomes the much better way to maintain DPS uptime. And Longsword being the premier counter weapon with so many different countering tools in Sunbreak is just pretty much designed for the monsters. This combination of factors in Rise not only made Longsword the highest DPS option for fighting monsters, it also made it one of, if not the safest, which is kind of the definition of overpowered. And I don't really mind that this particular playstyle got more skill intensive and is more difficult to use, especially because other longsword playstyles got buffed that are easier to use by casual players. For the casual players who aren't really a big fan of the EI Spirit slash playstyle because they either don't have the skill or the monster knowledge to consistently pull it off, and they don't know the openings for helm breakers, so they have to YOLO it every time and risk getting knocked out of the air, the buffs to the other aspects of Longsword's kit is a significant buff to them because Sakura Slash is much stronger and they can also swap to Helmbreaker. This means that you can use Sakura Slash to gain spirit levels while using Helmbreaker for big bursts of DPS and kinda just rotate through these two. And a 7-second difference in terms of the cooldown for Helmbreaker probably isn't a huge concern for these players since they aren't going to be making use of every opening anyway. Not to mention you get access to both Serene Pose as well as Harvest Moon at the same time, and Harvest Moon can be used as a way to enable you to just use a spirit combo focused playstyle where you use that to attack a monster and then just foresight occasionally, which is overall a much less skill demanding playstyle than the typical spirit EI slash into Helmbreaker combos. So overall I am a big fan of these changes because it also enables all these other longsword playstyles to be a lot more viable than they were previously. I mean, for speedruns it's pretty much probably still gonna be just EI spirit slash into Helmbreaker, but it does give more variety. And with how overtuned longsword already was in base Rise, keeping them at around the same level while buffing all the other weapons up is pretty good. Now in terms of the actual Astalos and Malzeno speedruns for longsword, yes, the numbers are really low, but there are a few conflating factors for that. First off, the armor set in the demo is lacking Quick Sheath 3, which is a very important skill for longsword. Secondly, Astalos is just like a terrible matchup for longsword. With the way that Astalos' body and attacks are designed, unless Astalos is charged up, longsword is basically never hitting weak zones. At least with EI Spirit Slash, which is a pretty significant portion of the DPS rotations. EI Spirit Slashes against Malzeno also seem kind of inconsistent with dealing them X damage, which might be either a demo thing or just a thing with Malzeno's design because he's a very, very like Kelby monster. He moves around a lot. Overall, Longsword's probably going to be around the same level of power, at least based off of these changes, as it is in Monster Hunter Rise. So honestly, its Sunbreak rankings is really just going to depend on how much the buffs for other weapons end up pushing them up. One thing I do want to note is that Longsword is going to probably need to run Wirebug Whisperer 3 in the future for Sunbreak speedruns, and probably just in general. This will remove a little bit of damage from their sets, and considering that Switchaxe speedruns in Rise already ran Wirebug Whisperer 3, this does mean they're going to have a slight damage edge in terms of their builds over what Longsword will have. However, relative to their closest competitor, Greatsword, this isn't going to be much of a difference because Greatsword's also going to have Wirebug Whisperer 3. Speaking of which, let's talk about the big boy GigaChad sword itself, Greatsword. So the GigaChad sword is pretty much the one everyone's been talking about because it's very much looking to be the strongest weapon in Sunbreak, at least out of the Blade Master weapons. It is straight up number 1 in the Malzeno run period, including Bow, and is also number 2 in Malzeno right behind Bow by just about 10 seconds. So what change happened to Greatsword to turn it into GigaChad sword? Well, one thing: Hysteria. Hysteria is a ridiculous switch skill they got access to that basically gives them a counter for 2 wirebugs that lets them skip immediately to True Charge Slash. This means that a sufficiently skilled Greatsword player can basically True Charge Slash after most attacks a monster lands on you. And True Charge Slash, really, really big number. I don't think I can overstress how massive a buff this is for Greatsword because they just basically get constant access to their strongest move in the kit, which is probably the strongest move in the game, at least in terms of pure raw burst damage. The trade-off for this is that they still do take a little bit of chip damage through Hysteria, so they do need to maintain their health throughout the run. But who cares about that? GigaChad sword basically got access to an SAED counter that's faster and does more damage. Not to mention that if you have barrel bombs around, you can do the Shoryugeki trick that SNS speedrunners will use, where you use the barrel bomb to trigger Hysteria so you can access TCS even faster on downs. And did I mention that Greatsword is getting these kinds of times in the Sunbreak demo without even having Focus 3 on the set? Ludicrous. Now, I'm not actually entirely even sure if all Greatsword speedruns will run Focus 3 anymore because you don't necessarily need it if you're using Hysteria exclusively in a matchup. Like, it will speed up the charge time for your True Charge Slash after using Hysteria, but if the monster's openings don't need that speed increase, you might not need it. Now, Greatsword will need to run Wirebug Whisperer 3 to keep up the Hysteria spam, but regardless, this is a huge buff. And not just to speedrunners, any greatsword player who can learn how to use Hysteria counters properly is going to be doing a lot more damage. Hell, I might pick up greatsword just to see big number. I don't even know if greatsword had other switch skills that you could play with in the demo because Hysteria is all that matters, Hysteria is life, Hysteria is love. I don't really have much more to say on this, honestly. Hysteria is just incredibly strong, and if they don't change it or nerf it in some way in Sunbreak's full release, it's gonna be insane. So we can pretty much say for certain that the glow up from Greatsword to GigaChad Sword is pretty much gonna make it the best melee speedrun weapon in Sunbreak, right? I mean, it was already competing pretty decently with Longsword, right? And it's just insane now with Hysteria. Well, the answer to that is yes. So here's the thing about Hysteria, it is amazing for speedruns, it is amazing for casual players, it's not gonna work well in heroics runs. And for some reason in Monster Hunter Rise, there is a huge heroic speedrunner scene. In fact, unfortunately, the rankings that we have currently for the DPS ratios for speedruns in Monster Hunter Rise do include heroics runs. This heavily inflates weapons like Lance that are very good at running heroics, and also deflates weapons like Switchaxe that are just not very good at running heroics. Now, if I could filter out all of these heroics runs and only look at the non-heroics runs and then see what the rankings look like, then I would, but I ain't got time for that, and there's no option to do that in the speedrunning website, so shrug. Either way, Greatsword will undoubtedly be topping the charts when it comes to non-heroics runs, but heroics runs won't be able to make much use of Hysteria due to the chip damage. That being said, Greatsword heroics runs are already really good anyway, because you basically just flinch lock or trip lock a monster. And Hysteria still gives them a nice shortcut to TCS during downs, since, you know, a barrel bomb's chip damage isn't gonna kill you. But with the amount of heroics runs inflating scores currently, it's hard to say that if you include heroics runs, GS will definitely be at the top. And even if you don't include heroics runs, there is another weapon based on the Sunbreak demo that will definitely be giving GigaChad Sword a run for its money. So what weapon might be at the top? Well, we have one more to talk about, Switchaxe. Oh baby. Saving the best for last. Just in case you haven't gathered so far, I'm a Switchaxe main. So what changes, or rather change, happened to Switchaxe in the demo? Well, I checked through the numbers and Switchaxe had 0 motion value changes, so all of its attacks are doing exactly the same damage as they did before the demo, and we only got one new switch skill to play around with in the Sunbreak demo. Elemental Burst Counter. If Greatsword's Hysteria is a GigaChad, then Elemental Burst Counter is Hysteria's bench press spotter. This move is utterly ridiculous. So Elemental Burst Counter is a wire bug skill you can pop into whether you're in sword or axe mode. This move takes about 50 frames, so just under a second of wind-up time before you can actually activate the counter. When you do so, your hunter will swing and trigger an explosion. If during this swing animation your hunter gets hit by an attack or a roar, then you will have a successful counter and do the follow-up. The follow-up is a jet-powered spin attack that hits twice for massive shitloads of damage. How big are these fecal matter piles, you might be asking? Well, each of them have 90 motion value in the demo. Also, a successful counter immediately amps you, so both of these hits will be getting amped files. These file explosions hit for 10 motion value each, adding another 20, and the initial swings explosion hits for 35 motion value that ignores hit zone values. If you don't know what hit zone values are, they're basically the percentage of damage that each monster's body part takes. Generally, a decent weak zone most monsters have is around 55 or so we use that as an average, and if we're hitting that 55 hit zone value weak point on a monster, then this explosion is worth roughly 64 motion value. All in all, this means a counter is worth roughly 264 motion value. However, both the file procs as well as the explosion from the initial swing cannot crit, and assuming that you're running Weakness Exploit, which is about all the crit that you can actually fit into endgame Switchaxe skills, at least in the high rank currently, which means that puts the effective motion value around 75. Oh, and did I mention that because this amps you instantly, it lets you use Pyrophile Switchaxes without worrying about the long amp build-up time. And Powerfile weapons give you an extra 15% raw attack when you're in sword mode. This raw attack bonus though only works on your base raw, so on endgame sets in high rank currently it's roughly a 13.7, so I'll just say 14% attack roll buff. When we apply that, the effective motion value of this attack is roughly 290 or so. Now this effective motion value is going to go down if you're hitting a better weak zone and go up if you're hitting a worse weak zone. On top of that, if master rank sets let us have more crit skills other than Weakness Exploit 3 it's going to go down a bit, but this is just some napkin math, so 290 is a good enough number to work with. To give you context for how much damage roughly 290 motion value is, the Longsword's new Harvest Moon EI Spirit slash assuming all of the ticks hit is only at 168 motion value. Although Longsword's Red Spirit level does give you 20% more base roll, which is roughly an 80% damage increase, so let's just say it's 198. So this is dealing quite a bit more potential damage than the new EI Spirit slash is for Longsword. And Longsword's red level Spirit Slash is a base 245 motion value, and for some reason uses the yellow Spirit levels multiplier for your roll, so you're getting 10%, which effectively is around 9%, so it's around 267 motion value effectively. So this is around 10% more damage than Spirit Helmbreaker is, you know, plus or minus some depending on hit zones you're hitting, etc, etc. Another point of context is that the True Charge Slash at max charge level when empowered on Greatsword hits 264 motion value on its big hits. Although this also has a 1.3 times hit zone value modifier on it, so it ends up hitting out. The point is, this counter hits for a lot of damage. Hysteria allows Greatsword to use True Charge Slash as a counter, and we basically get the same thing with Elemental Burst counter. Also, it amps us. This is basically the strongest counter in the game that's also fairly spammable as long as you have Wirebug Whisperer 3 and focus on getting 3 Wirebugs. And Switchaxe is one of the few weapons in base Rise that didn't have a counter, which meant that against matchups that a counter would be, well, really nice against, it struggled a lot. And even though the world record run done by Puni right now that's on screen is a solid 37 seconds behind the Greatsword world record, I'd argue that these two times are much closer than you might think. See, in this run, Puni, god that they are at playing Switchaxe, does fail to stop Malzeno from leaving the initial area. This wastes a solid 22 seconds before they can start fighting Malzeno again. In the world record Greatsword run, they prevent this from happening by chaining both a lucky feline stake driver thingy that knocks the monster over, as well as a very well calculated KO to the head with tackles. This is enough to re-aggro Malzeno and keep them in the first area. In fact, the second and third fastest Greatsword speedruns against Malzeno both fail to stop Malzeno from leaving the first area, and those two runs are respectively 2 and 3 seconds faster than this Switchaxe run. In fact, every single run that is more than 7 seconds faster than its run succeed in stopping Malzeno from leaving the first area. Either with Bow and IG, where they use an alternate start location where him leaving the area isn't really a big deal due to the timing of the Pteranodon mounting, or in the case of Gunlance runs where they make use of a marionette spider to down Malzeno so they can get enough damage out to re-aggro him. Or they get really lucky and the feline stake driver thingy knocks them down right around when he's trying to leave. I'll be honest, I think if Puni had used the marionette spider strat, it's very possible they could have had a much more competitive time closer to the Greatsword and Bow's times. But honestly, I can understand why they would be satisfied with a sub 6 time. It is an incredibly impressive run, and also I can't even imagine the amount of grinding needed to achieve it. Especially because I would argue that Elemental Burst counter is the most difficult to maximize counter in the game. There's a few reasons for this. One, it's a preemptive counter similar to EI Spirit Slash where you have to spend a little under a second preparing before you can activate the counter. B, it continuously drains your sword gauge while you hold it and have not yet activated the counter. In fact, it takes just around 8 seconds to drain a full sword gauge with it. So we'll just say that's about 12.5% of your sword gauge per second. That is a lot considering that you only get back 40% with Switch Charger. So if you misread the timing on a monster's attack and have to wait around for a second or two, you are losing a massive amount of your sword gauge. You need to have a lot of monster knowledge and experience fighting a monster to learn the proper timings to prepare and then activate your counter at just the right times. By contrast, a longsword can use its special sheath and wait for a few seconds before EI Spirit countering no problem. In fact, if you go back and watch a world record run against Malzeno for longsword, you'll see there are many times where they are holding their EI Spirit Slash for 2 seconds or more. If you were doing that with Switchaxe, you'll be losing a quarter of your sword gauge every time, which is what makes Puni's run so incredibly impressive. If you pay attention, you'll notice they lose little to no sword gauge on every counter. If this was a reactive counter where you could just press the button and immediately counter, then this would be a different story. Like Longsword's Foresight Slash, or Charge Blade's Guard Points, or SNS's Shoryugeki. But because this has almost a second of windup, you do have to read ahead of the monster's movements. There are a lot of monster attacks that have under a second of windup. The point is that this playstyle is not nearly as easy to execute as speedruns would make you think. And on top of the potential of losing all of that sword gauge, if you mess up the counter, you're also down to wire bugs. That all being said, the actual successful counter window is pretty generous. The actual swing itself finishes in 30 frames. I honestly haven't been able to get around to testing how many, if any, of the frames after this swing actually count for the counter, especially because they'll just be a lot easier to do in the training room, but this does mean that at bare minimum it has half a second of successful counter window, which is pretty good. Overall, this is an insanely strong new move in the Switchaxe's kit, and when you can truly master it and spam the crap out of it, you get incredibly fast times. However, at least from personal experience, I'll say when you're not that skilled, it is incredibly difficult to execute this playstyle well. So a counter spam playstyle might not be the best option for a lot of casual players. Fortunately, just the fact that this immediately amps you makes it incredibly strong for Switchaxe players even if you don't spam it. At the bare minimum, if you can learn to use this counter on a monster's roar at the beginning of a hunt, you will have amp immediately. And double fortunate, this playstyle being optimal is actually matchup dependent. For you see, the World Record Astalos run only uses this counter to get amp. The rest of the run is just the traditional speedrun strategy for Switchaxe, which is spamming the crap out of ZSD on good weak points. And remember, none of Switchaxe's motion values got buffed in the demo. Not to mention that this Switchaxe build beginner demo is incredibly unoptimized for ZSD spam, which normally wants to use elemental weapons with high elemental attack. And this speedrun is a solid second place, only 7 seconds behind the world record greatsword run. For a variety of reasons, Astalos just is not a great matchup for this counter spam playstyle. So there are still definitely going to be matchups where we don't want to counter spam anyway, and even if you can't counter spam very well, you still have traditional Switchaxe played just, with free amps. In fact, the last video on this channel was me getting a 5-minute and 7-second run against Astalos with Switchaxe, and I'm not that great at this game. I'm just a Switchaxe stan that likes analyzing data and spreadsheets and, well, math. So if you're a pleb like me, elemental burst counter is still a big boon to Switchaxe even if you aren't skilled enough to spam it on counter matchups. And just having access to a counter makes Switchaxe so much more able to deal with a lot of monsters that were annoying as hell to fight in the past. Now, this is just with Elemental Burst counter. I also cannot wait for the full release where I get to mess around with 2-stage Morph Slash, because if it works the way I think it's going to work, then holy crap, it's gonna be a great addition to the kit. But I'll save talking about that until after the full game releases, because I don't want to purely speculate. So with how amazing this buff to Switchaxe is through Elemental Burst counter, I must be a very, very happy camper, right? Right? Yes? So the thing is that online, a lot of Switchaxe mains are not very happy with Elemental Burst counter, and while I definitely wouldn't say I'm mad at it like a lot of them would, I kind of agree with a lot of their points. The simple reality is that this Elemental Burst counter is a bit too strong. It does way too much damage, and yes, the high amount of damage means it's going to be competing for possibly the top speedrun times possible, but it also might end up dominating the kits. Like, if this does allow Switchaxe to be the #1 speedrunning Blade Master weapon in Sunbreak, that's neat and all, but like I said at the beginning of this video, power rankings don't really mean that much. It's like, yeah, I get to say that my weapon is better than your weapon when played by people who are incredibly more skilled than either you or I are. Like, I'm glad that it's a very skill-intensive counter that requires you to know a monster matchup very well to maximize. Like, my issue with Longsword and Rise was never that they were the #1 melee weapon to speedruns, it's that when I played it myself, it felt way too damn easy. That and Switchaxe and Rise just has such a cool moveset and I love using it, and the idea that the optimal way to play might be to completely ignore that and just spam the hell out of a counter and occasionally fit in double slashes or morph combos is kinda eh. And the counterpoint that most people tend to bring up when people complain about this with the new Elemental Burst counter is, well, it's optional. And I mean, they're not wrong, it is entirely optional whether you use it or not. You can still play completely different playstyles with Switchaxe, and as the ZSD playstyle shows off in the last Astalos run, it's still very effective against certain matchups. The problem I have with its power is that what the power differential between the counter spam playstyle and other playstyles against counter spam monsters like Malzeno will look like. It's one thing to say that a meta playstyle is optional if you're only dealing like 20 to 30% less DPS, but when your hunts are taking twice as long, it's a bit of a different story. I'm not saying that's gonna be the case with Switchaxe, but I worry it might be. Because I tried using a ZSD playstyle on Malzeno and that shit don't work. And I was able to get some runs over 12 minutes against Malzeno with a counter playstyle, but like if I didn't use counters, holy crap, I would have not been able to finish in 15 minutes. I don't know, I guess just my personal concern is that it's so strong that in a lot of matchups, it's probably just gonna dominate as a spam move. And I don't know if you know this about me, but I like numbers. If my hunt time gets too long, I lose serotonin. I'll be honest, if they half the damage on Elemental Burst counter and also half the amount of sword gauge drain it have, I would like it a lot more. I love the utility it gives you through giving you a counter to make certain matchups a lot better for Switchaxe, and I love the fact that it amps you instantly. I don't like the fact that it's so powerful that against monsters like Malzeno, we're basically playing Longsword with a stronger counter and more risk. And also, that's only one of the two major points I see Switchaxe mains bringing up about the counter. The other one being that it just doesn't really feel like it fits the Switchaxe identity. And I also have to agree with that. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that having a counter in Switchaxe's kit is against its identity. In fact, I've been wanting to have guard points ever since Monster Hunter World. The thing is, at least to me, Switchaxe is about being an aggressive, combo-intensive, very fancy, fun weapon with cool morphing attacks. One that has a very interesting level of repositioning and mobility while maintaining aggression through the use of either fade slashes or fade morphs or rolling morphs, things like that. And these attacks that deal damage while repositioning got even stronger in Rise because of the addition of Rapid Morph increasing animation speeds. A counter that makes you stop moving, sit there, and wait for a monster to hit you so you can counter attack just does not feel like it fits into that. It feels like it disrupts the flow and turns me into Longsword. Instead of enhancing the playstyle and strengths of Switchaxe and all of the cool morphing attacks and stuff, it just kind of replaces it. And again, going back to the amount of damage thing, if it dealt a lot less damage but still had the utility it had of giving me a counter when I have to deal with moves that are very hard to dodge effectively and also gave me amp, I would be very happy about its addition to the kit. Mostly because things like amp buildup and especially having a counter to deal with annoying to dodge moves or impossible to dodge moves is something I felt like Switchaxe really needed. I'm really happy to have that utility now, but I don't think that Elemental Burst counter was the best way to add that. But I'm also a big believer of the idea that if you don't like something and want to complain about it being in a game, you should be able to suggest some kind of alternative. Because the point of this entire tirade I'm doing at the end of this video isn't for me to just go where I don't like the new move, it's to say that I think it could be improved. Now, I am not a game designer. However, I very clearly love Switchaxe, and I have spent quite a bit of time recently and in the past just thinking about how I would want a counter to be implemented in its kit. Something that adds utility to, enhances, and improves Switchaxe's playstyles instead of replacing them. Now, in the context of Monster Hunter Rise Switch skills, it'll probably be something along the lines of a contextual morph skill that has a guard point or counter built into it that provides certain buffs or bonuses. That also would allow you to combo into some of the stronger combo chains that Switchaxe has. For example, let's say you're in Axe mode and you use we'll just call it the theoretical morph counter, or TMC for short. It'd be something like a slower morph into sword mode during which you have a guard point or counter window. And then on a successful counter, you build up a bunch of amp, maybe not going all the way there, but let's say like 30% of a power file maxed out. And then the actual counterattack itself may not do excessive damage, but it deals a decent amount, is fairly fast, and can immediately be comboed into your double swing axe morph. This would not break up the flow and also reward you not only with building up your amp gauge, but by giving you access to one of your stronger combo rotations, aka the axe double swing. And then if you already have your amp active, then it gives you some other kind of temporary buff, like, I don't know, let's just say it gives you double file procs for like 10 seconds. This would allow you to not only have more damage just using the rest of your kit the way you normally would be using it, but also has the added cool factor of twice as many explosions, which would feel satisfying as hell. And since this TMC would be a contextual morph, that means if you're in sword mode, it would instead morph you into axe mode and give you different bonuses. Like maybe it would give back a chunk of your sword gauge, or maybe it would increase the damage of your morph attack specifically, or maybe it could even give you a temporary buff to the animation speed of your mobility attacks like your fade morphs and whatnot. out, which is probably not something I would have asked for in the past, but we already know that they can do that with the technology they have with Rapamorph 3. And after this counter hits, let's just say it's a big downward axe slam because that's probably cool. You could then immediately combo that by morphing the sword for a rising double slash. And rising double slash is the one that can also immediately combo into a triple slash, which is basically the highest pure sword DPS you can get out of a combo. Or maybe you can immediately combo it into ZSD or something like that, I don't know. The point is, I would prefer for the counter mechanic to reinforce the current Switchaxe playstyles instead of replacing it with a new one, and to not really break up the flow of Switchaxe gameplay by basically making you sit there and wait for a thing to hit you. A boy can dream. Ultimately, at the end of the day though, I am just really happy that we have access to a counter as well as an amp mechanic. It may not be what my ideal amp and counter mechanic looks like, but regardless, I'm glad that we have it, and I'm still incredibly excited for Sunbreak. And this video is way too long now, so I'm gonna end here. Last few things I want to mention before we close out the video. If you're still looking to buy or pre-order Sunbreak, then we have a Nexus GG you can do that through. It costs you exactly the same amount of money as you would get it off of Steam, including any discount Steam currently has for the game, and Nexus.gg gives you a Steam code for the game, so it's really no difference, but you get to help support us because we get a kickback from it. And if you already own Sunbreak and are playing it, there are still plenty of other games on Nexus.gg you can buy through our link, which is nexus.gg/tuner. Yes, we're using Tuner's name for it because he's the one who's still actually producing content over on Twitch, and I'm just his math nerd boyfriend. Any support you give your boys is appreciated. Speaking of Tuner, don't forget to head over to twitch.tv/tuner to come hang out with us live. Tuner streams most days of the week, and I do hang out in chat sometimes, play sometimes, and with Sunbreak coming up, we're gonna be playing a lot of Sunbreak. So if you want to see me fail every elemental burst counter in multiplayer, because holy crap, it is hard to counter monsters in multiplayer, be sure to come by twitch.tv/tuner and come shit on me in chat. Alright, that's all I got for this video. Holy shit, it's 50 minutes long. Alright, we'll see you next time. Bye!